All right, so we are going to go on ahead and get started with Introduction to Podcasting. So, a very basic question to get started. What is a podcast? Hopefully, all of you are at least somewhat familiar with what the concept of a podcast is, but whether you are or not, here is a quick definition. A podcast is a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading to a computer or mobile device, typically available as a series, new installments of which can be received by subscribers automatically. So, a really easy way to think about it is kind of like radio shows, except you can listen to them whenever you want. Why get into podcasting? Well, for starters, it is a growing uh, type of media. We have been seeing an enormous rise in the number of Americans who regularly listen to podcasts. As you can see here, this is a graph from 2018 to 2021, and it's the percent of Americans. So last year, we had 57% of Americans that had listened to a podcast at some point. So definitely a growing medium, very, very popular. They're excellent to listen to on commutes or while doing work or anything like that. So definitely worth looking into. So what am I going to be doing here today? I am going to be talking to you about some of the basics of starting a podcast. However, we have 45 minutes. I am only scratching the surface. So I am also going to be directing you to a variety of St. Louis County Library resources that you can then use to learn more about podcasting and related topics. So we're going to pause here at the beginning, and I'm going to point out two very fantastic e-course websites that you can access through the library, as well as some specific courses you can get on them. So the very first of these is Gale Courses. They have a class called Blogging and Podcasting for Beginners. I have taken this class. It is very good. So I'm going to show you really quickly here what Gale Courses looks like. Oops, let's pull up the right thing here on our website. Okay, so the library homepage, where do we get to the e-courses? It's not super clear. It is actually under Using the Library. And then if we go under Personalized Learning, we have our e-courses right here towards the bottom. E-courses are free online classes that you can take. They are, for the most part, self-paced. A lot of them are video classes. So they are all taught by third parties, not librarians. But yeah, we have some really fantastic ones. The first of which, like I said, is Gale Courses. Now, Gale Courses is a bit of an outlier in that it is not strictly on-demand learning. You can't just come in here and start whenever you want, for example, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Again, we're doing podcasting, so we're going to search for a class on podcasting. And there we go, blogging and podcasting for beginners. And here's what I was talking about. These classes have set start and stop dates. So you have to enroll in them and then participate. There are basically 2 lessons published each week for 6 weeks. So it's a nice, somewhat slow-paced way to learn a topic. It gives you a lot of, it gives you structure. So if you like structure and want to go in depth into a topic over a period of time, Gale Courses is excellent for that. Whatever you're interested in here, and we have way more than just podcasting. There are tons, as you can see here along the catalog, lots of topics, very good classes. I've taken quite a few of them. If you're interested in one, you just have to click Enroll Now, select your start date, and then when you click Continue Enrollment, if you have never used Gale Courses before, you will use New Students Start Here to create your account. And then that's how you'll log in ever after it. It will be connected to an email. And basically, that is how it's how it tracks your progress. So that's all we have time for today on Gale Courses and looking into it. There's a lot more to know about it. Well, not a lot, but some more to know about it. If you have any questions, I do recommend Book a Librarian. Book a Librarian, you can get to this form under Using the Library, Book a Librarian, And you can fill this out and basically meet one-on-one with a reference librarian like myself, and we can walk you through the library's resources. I'm going to be going on ahead and popping that link into the chat. And it looks like we have our first question. Is a library card required for the courses? Yes, Sylvia. A library card is required to access any of the St. Louis County Library resources that I am discussing today. Good question. Okay, so blogging and podcasting for beginners, great, especially if you want to go a little bit more in depth, take your time a little bit more. The next e-course is very different. It is basically on demand. It is just a video called Producing Podcasts, and it walks you through the entire process from like what a podcast is all the way up through actually getting your podcast out into the wild. And it is on a e-course platform called LinkedIn Learning. Just quickly going to pop back over here. And LinkedIn Learning, some of you may have accessed before when it was called lynda.com. It is the exact same resource. It just has a new name and a nice shiny new look. LinkedIn Learning is one of the only e-course platforms that we have where you do not need to create a separate login. All you need to do to log in is enter in your card number and your PIN, and then you will be good to go in here. Now, I really love LinkedIn Learning because of its on-demand nature and because they have a lot of classes on technical matters. So again, this is part of our Small Business Expo week, and there are lots of small business skills that you can learn in here, social media marketing, different softwares if you're interested in learning Microsoft Office or any Adobe products. They have lots of different classes, but we're going to do podcasting. And here we go. We've got producing podcasts. That's the one that I had pulled out, but they have other classes as well, including ones that are specifically for businesses. So if you are a small business owner, something like this might definitely be worth looking into. But producing podcasts is a really good one. Like I said before, this is a video class. You can start and stop it whenever you would like. So that is really all I'm going to do for showing you resources on our library website, because I'm going to just talk a lot now about creating your podcast. So these are two good courses if after today's presentation, you still want to dive in a little deeper or you have more questions about podcasting. Either producing podcasts on LinkedIn Learning or blogging and podcasting for beginners from Gale Courses are a fantastic place to start. Now, a couple of questions while you're thinking about creating a podcast. The very first one is, do you have the time to commit? So creating a podcast is a massive commitment. You are going to be spending time and money. You're going to need to be creating fairly regular, fairly high quality content, which, yeah, is going to be stressful at times. But that being said, it is a very fun way to be creative, to share your passion with others. As you saw from that graph, there is a growing audience for podcasts, and it's just a really good way to communicate with an audience. And also the spending time and money. Time is really what you're going to be spending. How much money you end up spending really depends on your personal preferences. You can do podcasting pretty cheaply. I will say, because you do need a host, which we will talk about, I don't think it's ever going to be $0, but it does not have to be expensive. So another question you're going to want to ask yourself is, how long is my podcast going to be? And by this, I mean, how long are the actual episodes going to be? So in general, the more frequently you update, the shorter your podcasts can be. So for example, there are some crazy people who release content every single day or every single business day. They can generally get away with having like a 15-minute, a half-hour podcast, much shorter in terms of what they are putting out there, because they put out so much content. If you are planning on going with a less frequent upload schedule, you're typically going to want to do longer episodes just because people have waited. You want to make it worth their wait when you finally drop an episode. Now, just a quick note here, I'm talking a lot about podcast schedules, and you might think, well, can I just release podcasts whenever I feel like it? And absolutely, you can do that. However, a big part of podcasting is growing an audience. And to grow an audience, one of the things people like the most is reliability. They like to know that every Monday at 3 o'clock, their favorite podcast on whatever is going to be on their phone and they can listen to it on their commute. People really, really like that. It's actually part of your marketing strategy to create content regularly, which is why it's important to think about this from the very beginning. And yeah, last point on here, do all your podcasts have the same length or will they vary? There's a lot more flexibility on this. In general, though, podcasts will fall in a certain time frame. Like they'll all be an hour, they'll all be 2 hours or whatever. So you kind of just can pick one. So like if I was running a podcast, I would probably do 1 hour episodes. You might say, I actually need 2 hours, or you could just say, doesn't matter how long or short they are, I'm going to vary it. But just, think about these things. A lot of podcasting is, yes, you do have to sit down and just do it at some point, but you also have to really think through what your plan is. So next, what style are you going to use? There are a lot of different styles for podcasting. So for example, interview style is a very popular one. You can be the host and then you bring in different people to interview about whatever it is you're interested in or whatever the podcast is about. A lot of people do solo podcasts. This is probably the easiest because all you need is yourself. But you can also have more than one host. So again, small business owner, maybe you have a business partner and you're looking into creating a podcast together. That's another way to go. And then of course, you can combine the above types and there are even different types entirely, but definitely consider what style of podcast you're going to use because that is going to inform a lot of decisions as you continue the process of developing this product. Okay, next, creating your podcast. So we've had, thought a little bit like, can we get into this? Here are some very basic things, basic questions that I need to answer. Well, the next step is to actually create the idea for your podcast. So podcasts are pretty much all some kind of story, okay? And I'm going to be using story pretty frequently here. And when I say story, I do not mean a fictional narrative. It just means that there is some kind of tale being told there, okay? So, for example, your podcast could be about an interest or hobby that you want to teach others about. It could be personal experiences that you want to share. Maybe a podcast about getting your business off the ground as you actually do it. Maybe it is a narrative. Maybe you actually literally have a story that you want to tell, and you're going to do it through podcasting. So, I'm going to give you a couple of different ways of developing your story. And you'll see here what I mean by everything's a story, even if it's not fiction. So there are two ways to do this. I mean, there are lots more, but there are two ways that I'm covering. The first one is to create a focus sentence. And the second is to use the XY story formula. So let's take a closer look at those. First of all, create a focus sentence. Someone, the protagonist, which can be just you, the podcaster, by the way, does something, an action, because of something, a motivation, but conflict. So, for example, I don't have a podcast personally. I create like learning experiences, mostly with video. But if I were to podcast, this is what I would actually podcast about. I recreate historical recipes. So I am the protagonist. I am recreating the recipes. That's the action because Cooking connects people through the ages. That's my motivation. But I'm not very good at it, and the results can be hilarious. There's my conflict. So again, it's not fictional at all. It's a real thing that I'm doing, but you do have a story there, and people love story. That will engage your readers almost more than anything else. Okay, the XY story formula is even more simple. I'm doing a story about X, literally anything you want. And what's interesting about it is Y, something interesting, surprising, or unexpected to the audience. So this is just a goofy example that I made up. I'm doing a story about the pop culture of the 90s, our podcast about that. And what's interesting about it is that I lived through the 90s basically off the grid and have no idea who the Fresh Prince is. So I'm discovering all of this for the first time. So the XY story formula, because you really only have to come up with what you're doing your podcast about and the one thing that's interesting about it, that's an easy one to do. Now, why are we putting all this thought into the theme, the story of our podcast? Well, because this is the big question you have to address when it comes to podcasting. How is this going to matter to my audience? Your audience is going to be listening to you, to your podcast, to get something out of it. Now, that could be information. It could be entertainment. It could be to follow a narrative. It could be to see how you grow, to help them grow. There has to be a reason that people will listen to your podcast. Now, that reason is going to vary from person to person. And that's the great thing about podcasts. You can do podcasts about something super obscure, and very likely, if your storytelling is good, you're going to get an audience for it. So I'll use a random example, well, a personal example. I love 18th century Scandinavian history. This is so obscure and so weird, barely anybody talks about it. But there is at least one podcaster who has covered this period of Scandinavian history. So yeah, they're not making it for an audience of thousands, but they are passionate about something, and I am passionate about it, so I get to learn from them. So how this matters to your audience, you are going to want to think about. But at the end of the day, podcasting is also such a field with like opportunities abounding for you to do weird and quirky and obscure things and still get an audience. So do keep this in mind, but also don't freak out too much about it. Okay, now I'm not going to show you guys Gale courses because I already did that, but just know they have a lot of creative writing classes. So if you are interested in developing your skills as a writer, as a storyteller, they have classes for that. Again, not just for fiction, plenty for nonfiction as well. Things like writing essentials, travel writing if you want to do a travel podcast, write your life story if you're doing one with a more personal twist. Each one of these listed here, it's its own course. Again, it would run for 6 weeks. I've taken quite a few of these and they are very good. So definitely worth checking out if you are interested in learning about writing a bit more. Okay, next. So we've decided we're making a podcast. We've thought about what our story is, what our podcast is actually about. Now we need to talk about branding the podcast. Now, branding your podcast is going to involve creating the title, creating the artwork, creating the description. All of that is super important when it comes to, actually starting to build an audience. So your title, this is not rocket science. It should clearly communicate what your podcast is about. So, that's pretty straightforward. And here's a way of testing that. Tell someone the name you are considering and see if they can tell you what the show is about. It's all well and good to have a quirky or punny title, but if it's not super obvious what the podcast is about, it may not be fantastic, because you want people to see the title and go, yeah, like, yeah, that's something I want to listen to, because it interests me. It sounds like something I'd want to listen to. Anyway, okay, moving on. The artwork. The artwork is super important. Your podcast's artwork is like its logo. It's the big old sign that's going to draw people to your podcast. So how do you create the artwork? There are lots of different ways to do it. You can hand draw it if you want. You can create it on a computer. You can hire someone else to do it. There are also websites where you can like create logos digitally by just clicking and dragging things. So there are lots of options when it comes to creating your podcast artwork. So if you are not if you don't feel particularly artistic, don't worry. There are ways around that. But that being said, the title and the artwork are the first thing someone is going to see when they're, scrolling through, I use Apple. So when I scroll through the podcasts on there, what do I see? The title and the artwork. And if that doesn't interest me, then I keep on scrolling. So you want something that is going to jump out a bit at people. And what I recommend is scroll through a podcast directory, like, again, on your iPhone or whatever you choose, and just see what titles and what artwork other people are using and see what you gravitate towards personally. You might like some artwork more than others. Maybe you like ones that are more photography. Maybe you like ones that are like just simple shapes. And just figure out what you enjoy the most, and then you can use that for your own artwork. Okay. The description. So someone is scrolling through a podcast directory, they see the title, they see the image, and they're like, sounds interesting. They click on it, and the next thing they are going to see is the description. This is where you can go into a little bit more depth. You can talk about what your podcast is, why you created it, who you are. While you can have more fun here, it still should be clear, concise, and informative. And you are going to want to include relevant keywords to increase search engine optimization. And what I mean by that is when you type in something into a podcast directory like iTunes, you want your podcast to come up with certain keywords. Okay, what do I mean by that? So again, jumping back to my example, historical cooking, since that's what I would podcast about, in my description, I would want to include things like historical cooking and food history. So that way, when somebody searched those in the podcast directory, my podcast would come up. So definitely think about like what audience you're trying to get and what keywords they would use to find this type of material, and then include those in your description. You don't have to go crazy with this. You don't need to have a million keywords. Just think of like 2, 3 that you really, really want to include, and then work those in. Okay. Moving on to recording your podcast. You've had the idea, etc. We've been starting to build on it. Well, now we actually need to sit down and record the thing. So how do we do that? Well, you're going to need a couple of tools for this. And the very first thing you are going to need is a microphone. A microphone is pretty much the most basic tool you are going to need for creating a podcast. And there are a couple ways that you can do this. Now, again, you are probably going to be spending some money if you create a podcast. How much, though, is entirely up to you. When it comes to a microphone, you can use a built-in microphone. And what that means is the microphone that already exists on your computer or on your phone. Now, just a word of caution, depending on the device, the sound quality may not be phenomenal, but it may still be good enough for what you're trying to do. And a lot of phones now have pretty decent mics, so you don't need to worry too much about that, especially with the newer phones. If you are using your phone to record, you will probably need to download some kind of app. These are a couple of apps, Voice Record Pro for Apple, and then Voice Recorder by Lovecara for Android. I have I believe it's been a while, but I believe I tried Voice Recorder Pro since I do have an Apple device. They're basically, these are just two examples. There are lots of different recording apps that you can use to record and store audio. Now, that is built-in is probably the easiest and cheapest way to use or get a microphone. You can also invest in an external microphone. So that would include like the headset that I am using right now. I also use a standing mic for a lot of my recordings as well. Now, when you are looking into buying an external microphone, you need to consider how it picks up sound. And it can be omnidirectional, bidirectional, unidirectional, and then there are others, but those are the ones that I am going to be discussing today. What do I mean by those? Here you go. So omnidirectional microphones pick up sounds from everywhere. So if you were doing a recording where you wanted to capture the sound from literally, a 360 radius around you, omnidirectional would be a good way to go. Sometimes studio musicians will use this kind of microphone sometimes. So yeah, because then you can pick up sound from multiple people. The next one we have here, and let me just see, the bidirectional, pretty straightforward. It goes in two directions. This is good for interview or host styles because, you're going to have two different people. You're picking up sound from two different directions. And then finally, we have unidirectional. And unidirectional microphones will pick up sound from, oops, did not mean to do that. We'll pick up sounds from one direction. And this is a really good choice for solo podcasting. If you are the only host and you only want to pick up sound from one direction, unidirectional is a good way to go. There are microphones where you can actually switch between these different styles. That is what I have. And it is a nice option, although they can be a little pricey. You'll just have to look into it and decide for what you're trying to accomplish, what do you need? All right, here are some tips for working with a cheap microphone, and I do include in that your, computer or phone microphones. Again, I would say this actually goes for most microphones, regardless of whether they're cheap or not. Yeah, don't talk too far away from the microphone, which catches more room noise and makes it harder to hear you. And also don't talk too close because that results in plosives and clipping audio. So if you're not familiar, plosives are going to be like those little puffs of air you hear when I say anything that starts with a P sound. I'm not 100% sure if my microphone right now is picking up on them. They are pretty common though. So one easy way to get rid of those is to use something called a pop filter. And this is just like a little mesh screen that you attach to a microphone and it kind of muffles those sounds. They're very cheap. You do not need to spend a lot to get one of these. All right. And then, yeah, finally, don't touch the microphone while you're recording. Unfortunately, the headset that I use for these is connected to my computer with a USB cord, so you might hear me brushing against it regularly. Try not to have things like that. If you can go wireless, that is better just because then you don't pick up noises from the wires moving around. Okay, recording location. You are going to want to pick as quiet a space as possible. So what I recommend, and I recommend this even if you're not really hunting for a location, like if you just have, where you're going to be recording because it's your only option, definitely test your audio multiple times. So what I mean by that is take your microphone if you are scouting for a location in your house or in your office, make different recordings in multiple locations and then listen back to them and see what background noises are being picked up in those locations. And kind of just jumping back really quickly here, how to test like not talking too far away, not talking too close to the microphone. It's by making test recordings. Test recordings are your friend when it comes to creating podcasts. You want to make sure that your audio is very high quality. Low quality audio is generally not going to do your podcast any favors. Even if you have a fantastic story, there are just people who will not want to listen to that. So the other thing I recommend is to keep your microphone away from your computer fan. You will not realize how loud your computer fan is until you are recording, and then you listen back to your recording and you hear a whir in the background the entire time. So there are multiple ways to get around this. My personal preference, I record in a closet. It is the quietest place in my house, and I actually literally shut my computer out of the closet while I'm recording. So that ends up working. It doesn't pick up any computer sounds. And the only way I knew that was by testing things. So test, test, test. All right. Once you've recorded your podcast, you are going to have to edit it. Editing is something that, there's going to be some kind of learning curve when it comes to editing audio. But in general, it's not that hard once you get started. But the very first thing you need to decide is what software you are going to use. Now, there are actually quite a few free softwares out there, Audacity on Windows. And you know what? I did forget to look it up before. I think GarageBand is free as well. Let me just see here. Yes, it is free. Sorry about that. Yeah, so GarageBand for Mac, Audacity for Windows. You can go on ahead and download these if you are interested in audio editing. Audacity is one of the most popular free audio editors. Again, this one is I believe, specifically for PCs. Full disclosure, this is not what I use personally because I do a lot of video editing. I have an audio/video editor called Camtasia. So again, you will have to do a little bit of research and decide what works best for you. But if you're looking to go the cheap route, Audacity is a pretty good choice. And in addition to that, it's actually one that there's quite a bit of information out there about. So for example, if you decide to go with Audacity for your podcast editing, LinkedIn Learning has an entire class that will walk you through the steps from downloading it all the way up through, cutting, stitching, removing background noise from your audio. So really good class. And also YouTube will also have a lot of classes on this type of thing. Okay. As part of this step, the editing process, you might want to consider the soundscape of your podcast. And what I mean by that is, are you going to include any background music, any introductory music, any sound effects? These that I have listed here are just a few different websites. Some are completely free resources and others cost money. So don't just be aware of that. These are not library resources on this page. They are just places online where you can get resources. Now, one thing I will mention really quickly here about sounds, music, etc. You need to make sure if you are taking sounds from somewhere online that you credit the person who created the information appropriately. And Freesound is not loading for me. That's usually what I use to demonstrate this. Let's see. Let's try Audio Box. Okay. I'm not as familiar with this one. Okay, well, I'm not going to waste your time on this. Basically, for any sound you decide to use, you need to see what, oh, here we go, finally. Let's do door one. So let's say we want to add the sound of a squeaky door being opened and closed to our podcast. I'm going to click on that. It may just play the sound automatically, unfortunately. Basically, they are going to let me know under what circumstances I am allowed to use this sound. So you can see that here. This work is licensed under the attribution license with the Creative Commons. What that means is, yes, I can use it for free, but I have to give credit. Oops, pop-ups. I have to give credit that says this is where I used this sound from. So definitely make sure whatever audio you are adding to your podcast. If you have not created it, make sure that you are using it in the appropriate way. You're adding in attributions if they are required. You are paying whoever needs to be paid. That particular one, free sound, you usually do not need to pay, but you may need to credit. Anyway, that gets all in a little bit complicated, but I do want it to be something on your radar, just because you can get in trouble for using sounds and music without taking the appropriate steps, shall we say. Okay, so once your podcast is edited, you are able to distribute it. So to distribute your podcast, you are going to need to download the file in the MP3 or MP4 format, and then you will need to save your file to a podcast host. Now, downloading your file in MP3, which is the most common, or MP4, less common, but still works, you can do that through whatever software you used to edit your podcast. Now, podcast host, what do I mean by that? A podcast host, or any host, honestly, is a website that hosts your media files. So they take your big old podcast files and they will house them, in their computers. Anyway, the reason for this is podcasts are incredibly big files, and you have to distribute them digitally somehow. If you decided to try and do this through your own website, it could be very expensive and very cumbersome to deliver them through your own website. A lot of times, if you do have a website, which I do recommend if you have a podcast, by the way, to actually host the files on your own website would be prohibitively expensive. So in general, you are going to look for an external host. So this is just a quick list of some of the more popular ones like Blueberry, SoundCloud, Buzzsprout, Libsyn, and Podbean. Now, each one of these has a different cost and has different features. So it is something you will need to look into, again, depending on how much you want to spend and what other features you're looking for. You can take a look at these different ones and decide what you particularly are interested in. All right, now, then to distribute your podcast. So the host is just putting your files somewhere, okay? To actually get your podcast out into the world, you need to include it in podcast directories. So this would include things like iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Spotify. Each one of these has different rules about how you upload your podcast, but it's pretty easy to find instructions for any of them when it comes time to uploading your podcast. And you are not isolated to any one of these. You can upload your podcast to as many as you want, which is generally a good idea because, hey, the more your podcast is on different directories, the more potential it has for reaching your audience. Okay, now, once you have your podcast, you've done everything, you've got it, it's a product, it is up somewhere, it's in the directories, you're going to have to start thinking about marketing. Now, marketing is very often done in the podcast itself. Typically, people, the podcast host or hosts will ask listeners to leave a review and to subscribe to the podcast. That is what is called a call to action. And it's a very effective way of marketing your own podcast. Good reviews mean more people are going to click on your podcast. Same thing with more subscriptions. You might also want to consider using a website, social media, and or a newsletter to promote your podcast. I definitely recommend a website because when people look for your topic on just the internet, it's nice if a website can come up that directs them to your podcast, that explains what you're doing. Website creation is a whole nother topic, and every now and then I run a class on what resources the library offers that can kind of help you towards designing a website. But if a website seems too intimidating or you don't have the time to create one, you can just create social media accounts to promote your podcast. That works too. And in general, it's a good idea to always have social media accounts connected to your podcast. All right. And then finally, be consistent with releasing episodes. I kind of talked about this before, but you just definitely, that's a good way of showing your reliability to your audience. If you're not super familiar with social media, there's a fantastic class on social media, on LinkedIn Learning, excuse me, called Social Media Marketing Foundations that explains to you how to define your audience and walks you through how to use some of the more popular social media tools. All right, this is the last slide, monetization. A lot of people who get into podcasting, yes, they do it because they love it, but it's also a way of making money. How much money you make? Well, it varies, but these are some ways that you can monetize your podcast. The first is to get a sponsorship. So the most common of these is a referral. In other words, you sign up to be an affiliate of another company. If you have listened to podcasts at all, you have heard lots of advertisements for oh my goodness, I am blanking out. Audible, there we go. Audible. And that's a referral. And then there's also traditional sponsor. I guess they're not sponsorships. It's more like selling advertising space on your podcast. And you can do that. There are different websites where you can advertise that you have advertising space on your podcast. And that's another way to potentially make some money. You can also ask for listener donations. Oftentimes, podcasters will have something called a Patreon account. And if you are not familiar with Patreon, it is essentially just a way of offering, well, it's a way for your listeners to give you money in return for kind of behind the scenes features. So maybe some extra special podcasts that nobody but them get to listen to, some photographs, or it varies. I mostly use Patreon as an artist and follow artists, so a lot of times they'll do extra sketches and stuff like that. So basically it's a way of getting donations, but you are also giving something back. And then also I do have this article here with some other ideas, 12 ways to monetize a podcast, which is where I got most of the information here. Now, I did forget to mention this at the beginning. I will be sending a copy of these slides to everyone who attended the presentation, so you will have access to all of the links that are here as well. So, all that being said, if you ever do have any questions, you can always contact the St. Louis County Library. You can contact us by phone number, by email, reference@slcl.org, goes directly to my department. We have a chat feature on our research page. So if I go there, you'll just see it down here in the corner. We've got our chat button. And then finally, that book a librarian that I mentioned before.